Welcome everyone. In today's session we're going to be covering a very common teaching strategy or teaching and learning strategy called chunking. Now chunking is something that teachers, teacher aides and education professionals do quite regularly and quite naturally just as a part of their normal day-to-day and planning practices, even if they've never heard of the term chunking. It is, however, important to identify these good or best practices so that we can have a look at them in more detail and decide on the best approaches or what different options and different ways we can go about putting those particular strategies into practice, integrating them with other strategies, and overall making sure that we're reflecting on and thinking about whether we're going about our job as education professionals, no matter where we work, in the best and most effective manner possible. So chunking by and large is a very, very simple process. If you've watched some of my other videos, particularly on planning, you will have noticed that chunking is a part of the natural process of a lot of the things that we do in the education sector. Now, chunking basically means that you have a large problem, let's say represented by this box. This is a body of knowledge. Let's say that box represents a body of knowledge that a student needs to learn. And in there are some difficult things and some relatively easy things. We'll do some examples in a brief minute. Now, the first thing that most teachers or teacher aides will do is divide that problem or that body of knowledge into 4 separate sections. Maybe 6 sections, maybe 8 sections. It doesn't really matter. Now, sometimes also you may have sections that are a little bit bigger and other sections that are a little bit smaller. It really depends on factors such as the difficulty level of the particular problem or topic that we're covering at the moment. Now, let's say, for instance, that we've divided this particular problem into these 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 separate sections. Now that could represent 12 separate lessons, for instance, although in reality nothing is really ever as neat as that. And you may find that you'll get through 3 in one session. That one will take 2 sessions. That one, even though it's a larger section, may actually only take 15 minutes. So it depends on a lot of factors such as what type of information or previous knowledge students bring with them as well. So I'm just going to represent these by the amount of time that each of these takes by numbers. So let's say that takes 1 lesson, that takes 1, that takes 2, that's 0.5, that's 3, that's 6, that's 2, that's 1, that's 1, that's 1, that's 1, that's 3, for instance. So when you're going through, if you watch the planning videos that I've done, you'll also see that chunking out a body of knowledge or a topic into smaller sections is relatively simple, and it gives you that graphic ability to, as in you can graph it, you can see it on a piece of paper or a whiteboard, and you can see how you divide down different aspects of a topic into I guess time scales or time frames. Okay, so that's the basics of chunking as far as how a body of knowledge works or a topic is concerned. It can also be used in terms of solving a problem, and this is probably where it's most commonly used. So if it was some type of maths problem, you might divide that particular maths problem down into 3 separate processes or 3 separate sections. And teachers quite often do this in terms of what do we know and what do we not know. So we may know that one and know that one, but not know that particular process. Now, a lot of students will get stuck. Let's actually say there's another one afterwards and that we also know that one. Now, a lot of students will assume with a simple maths problem or a multi-level maths problem that if they get stuck somewhere, then they know 0. So their motivation obviously is quite low. In this particular instance, teaching chunking to students as something of a metacognitive skill, which is another strategy that I highly recommend. Metacognitive skill. So as far as a metacognitive skill, chunking is really, really important for students to learn so that they can fully understand what they know and what they don't know, and so they can divide problems up into, similar to this, they can divide it in using their own methods, not necessarily just following how the teacher has chunked it down or scaffolded it in various different ways. So a student will naturally assume that, let's say this is a maths problem, and there are 4 steps to solving this problem. Most students will assume that if they get that step wrong, even though they know that, they'll probably stop there, they won't even bother attempting that one, and they'll get the question wrong. And they'll assume that they get the entire question wrong, whereas in actual fact, they know how to do 3 of the 4 different steps. Now, this is potentially the hardest step. This is potentially the easiest step, say the first one, and the second and third one. Maybe there's a reason that they don't know this. Now, there could be various different reasons, again, for why this particular step they don't understand. It could be a simple knowledge reason. So they may just literally not know the step. They've never been told the step, they weren't paying attention, or they've forgotten about that step. It may be that they're confused. It may be because it's difficult. So the difficulty, the level of difficulty, we'll write level. The level of difficulty is particularly difficult there. But quite often there's a reason that they don't understand that particular step. That is, I guess the easiest way to explain that would be stepped problem. Let's go with stepped problem, through lack of a better word. So what they don't understand here is the process. In other words, that's probably a better way. So they've got issues with the process. Now, if you as the teacher aide or teacher come across a student who has problems like this, and almost all problems are related to a process of some description, whether it's writing a sentence, writing an essay, kicking a ball, or playing a sports game, or an art project, a science project, or even with upper high school students, if they're using formulas and things, there is always a multitude of steps to go through. And showing students that they actually know most of it already is actually a really good step in building their confidence so that they're willing to have a go. And then students can come into an exam or just go into any lesson or activity if they're working from home on their own and they don't have support to call on. Instead of reading the question and go, well, I have no idea, they can start chunking it down and writing out the various different processes, and then figuring out what aspects of that they can do that they're 100% sure, what parts they can go off and do a little bit of research on and nail pretty easily, and what parts they are required to get additional support for. Now, sorry, I'm sniffing a little bit here. Number 3, we've identified that there are 4 or 5 different reasons for why they may not understand step number 3. It could be because there is a process problem. They don't quite understand this aspect here. They don't understand how number 2 goes to number 3, how number 3 goes to number 4. So there's a conceptual problem there. And that's a really important point, is that concept. We'll get back. Concept understanding is called. So we'll get back to that in a sec because that's a really important point to make. It could be a simple piece of knowledge that they've forgotten. They could be quite confused. So again, that confused is sort of related to the concept understanding. But maybe if this maths problem is written in a language that is the student's second language, or there's some aspect of it that they don't quite understand, then going through the process is going to cause problems as well. Because there could be a language barrier issue or something along those lines there. Or maybe it's just way too difficult. Now, it could be difficult for those reasons, but it could just be difficult because that actual step is too challenging for the student right now. So that leads me to the next point about chunking, which is, let's go green, number 3. If it is too difficult, what we can do is chunk it down further. So then we take number 3, and that equals 1, 2, 3 more processes. So you're forever dividing those processes into smaller and smaller sections, or smaller and smaller topics, so that students can then attack them by looking at smaller aspects within each of these. Now, number 1 might be easy, number 2 might be easy, number 3 is where the student gets stuck. So the same process just repeats itself over here as well. And again, number 3, you might even then divide that down into 2 different processes. Oh, I've done that upside down, but you get the point. So going back to I guess this is our planning side of things over here, and it's how we did the basics of chunking, dividing lessons down or topics down into various different pieces. Now, it might be the case that, say, this one here, number 2, gets further divided down once you start teaching it, or for particular students it gets divided down. Okay, so that is basically the main concept behind chunking, is that you're dividing something that's difficult into something that's more manageable and further dividing it down to identify the real root causes of what's going on or where the problems are. And chunking is a really important metacognitive skill. So metacognitive just means thinking about thinking. So where we teach our students how to solve problems on their own. And one of the ways in which experts in any field go about solving problems is they proceduralize it. They put a system in place and they follow the system, and they narrow down within that system what they do and don't understand, and they keep narrowing it down until they get to one section where they are stuck, and then they've got a raft of other processes in place to figure out how they deal with that particular problem. So that might be seeking additional support, it might be research, it might be trial and error. There are a few different ways that we can go about doing that. But that's for a metacognitive webinar, not so much. We don't want to go into too much more detail about that here. Okay, so we were talking, before I get on to concept understanding and why that's important, we were talking here about how this is also useful for students, but it's also useful in the sense that you might teach this process to students. Not only are you diagnosing very specifically what they don't know and why they don't know it, but you can also teach these, because you've chunked it down into either a 4-step process or 4 separate sections, depending on what you're teaching. You can teach those in that chronological sequence as well. So if you're teaching a history class and you're looking at, say, the American Civil War, then you might decide that, teaching that is a very, not a difficult process, but there's a lot of information there. So you would chunk that down into various different sections and allocate times, or probably time to each section. That would be the first way, the first approach would be to divide it down. So to say, the first thing we're going to do is the overview, second thing is what caused it, third thing, fourth thing, and so on and so forth. So now, what that leads students to be able to do, for example, is to be able to hit exams and to be able to write out a procedure for almost any of the problems that they come across, whether it's a biology test, a maths test, an English test, even if they're writing essays or doing something more creative like short stories, or writing a letter or whatever, they can still write out a process and have a process to go, and they'll know that certain aspects of that process they can absolutely nail, and other aspects they might struggle with, which they can then divide further into smaller and smaller chunks, and to help them sort of get through. So that's a fantastic, chunking is fantastic for students in exams. Now, the other thing they can do if they're doing exams and tests, bearing in mind, watch those videos I've got about motivation, which I don't have any room, but otherwise I would write it up the top here as one of the main strategies. Motivating students and improving their self-esteem is the number one way to get them engaged and to get them working hard and to get them studying at home and to get them into class and maximising what we call on-task time or learning time, and minimise behavioural issues and off-task behaviours, right? So if students are motivated and they want to be there and they're feeling success, they're going to keep coming back for more. By chunking things down, you can let students know and do some type of formative or summative assessment, which is a different video, the different types of assessment on each of these. So students have an idea that, yes, I am successful here. Yes, I am successful here. This is an area, this one here I have to work on. This one here I have to work on. But I've aced that, I've aced that, I've aced that, and I've aced that. And these ones we haven't got to yet. So as far as helping students to hit goals and to achieve their goals so that they keep coming back for more, this whole chunking process is a really good way to achieve that. Now, we started talking about exams. Generally, exams are broken down into, let's say, or a test or whatever, into 5 sections. And let's say there's some type of essay down the bottom. Let's say there's some short answer questions here. Let's say there's some multiple choice. I'm just making this up. Let's say number 3 is some type of like an interpretive type subjective thing. So they might look at a historical cartoon and have to write something about it, or they may have to come up with something creative, or write a personal opinion or something like that. And let's say here is more of a technical question, or like a word technical, I guess, a bit like a, how would you say, real life. Let's just go with real life. Yeah, so the idea is that with this one, they're applying these simple things here in the real world somehow. So let's say there's a physics thing and they're answering some basic physics questions, and down here they've got some real world, real life type questions. Anyway, now students may be able to use chunking by looking at the various aspects of these exams and going, right, of this essay, I've absolutely aced that essay. So they come in, they've got a 4-step, 5-step, 6-step process for writing their essay. You can usually pretty much predict what they're going to be. And it could be, doesn't have to be an essay, it could just be a long question type of thing. So if they're happy that they're going to ace that, then their motivation improves, and they know that they're going to get a good score there because they've been preparing for it, and they know the different aspects of it. They know how to write an intro, they know how to write a conclusion, they know how to set it out with 3 or 4 steps in between. And they know they're going to get the short answer questions and the multiple choice right because, let's say that's worth 20% and that's worth 20% and that's worth, let's just say they're all worth 20%, right? Now they know that they're going to get them by and large right, and they know they're going to get that by and large right, because that's SAQ, those short answer questions. You've chunked those down and you've basically gone through and showed them that there's only about 10 different sections for this particular exam that they need to know. And then students can go, well, I know those 3, I don't know that, I know that, I know that, I know that. And then you can concentrate on that section by dividing that bit down further, and they can absolutely nail that particular topic as well. So when they get into these SAQs and the multiple choice, regardless of what the topic is, there are only so many questions that can possibly be asked in the particular exam, and you can get almost all of them right, provided you don't do something stupid, by chunking down the content of that course so far. So that's your SAQ, that's your multiple choice. You can assume you're going to get a really good score there, a really good score there, say 16 out of 20 or something, a really good score there, say 14 out of 20 at least, and then students can literally add that up and go, well, I'm going to get 16, 16 and 14, 10, 20, 30, 40, that's 46%. So they're already at 46% straight away. It's probably going to be more like 50 or so, and they haven't even attacked these ones yet. So that's a good way for students to divide it up. It also helps them divide up their time so that they can see how much time they should devote to each section. One of the problems with students in tests and exams and essays and things like that is they never plan out how much time they've got for the various different sections. And then just going through this chunking whole process allows students to make their own exams, swap exams with their friends. It's a good class activity. They can try and make really difficult questions that you can put on the board and go through in preparation as well. So anywhere from about year 3 or so onwards, right up to adults, students are going to be sitting tests at a regular basis for various different things. And chunking, this is just one example of probably a history/biology type exam that goes for an hour or 2. But for any type of assessment activity, or even any activity that isn't assessed, teaching kids how to divide things up into different ways and to figure out what they know and what they don't know is a really good way to attack any problem, or to, even if they're doing homework and they're studying over the holidays or whatever, being able to divide their time up or divide a certain topic up if they're doing an investigation, for example, that just like we were talking about with the American Civil War, if they divide that time up and their studies up and their approach up into several different sections. Because if you told students, I need you to go and learn about the American Civil War and that's your investigation, where do students take it from there? The first thing they do is do a little bit of initial research for say half an hour or so, Googling around, and then they can divide it down into smaller sections and concentrate on each section one at a time as if they are completely separate assignments. Okay, so that's the basics of chunking. I've done quite a few examples there that might seem a little bit confusing if you haven't come across this term, but just remember the simplistic nature of any teaching strategy and how that applies to the real world so that you can help your students out now or tomorrow. That's the best way to approach these strategies. And the simplistic nature of chunking is that you take a body of knowledge or a problem of some description and you just cut it into smaller pieces, figure out which one of those pieces you do know, and then cut it down a little bit further. One thing we were going to talk about is concept understanding, just quickly as something of a side note. Now, concept understanding basically means that if you've got a process problem like this one, where students have to follow a process, understanding the concepts behind the process and the reason for why those processes exist is more important than just memorizing each of these different processes, because then if they are required to memorize it and you get into an exam and there's a technical or an interpretive question that sort of mixes that process with another process and makes you do that process and then join them together, or maybe this particular problem doesn't give you is missing a bit of information that it has to be assumed information or whatever, that'll really throw students out completely. So understanding the concept behind things, not just memorizing the raw process, is really important. And to give you an example of that, there's a lot of research out that shows that experienced teachers and really well-trained teacher aides and educators give the answers to students around about, say, the best of them, probably 3% of the time. So out of 100 questions that students ask, teachers, teacher aides are only giving the answers to students between 3 and 11%. I think the research that I'm thinking of, which came out of the US, it was around about 11%, might have been 8%, something like that. Whereas untrained teachers and teacher aides who didn't have any pedagogical knowledge, in other words, they didn't know anything about teaching strategies or the science behind teaching, would give the answers to students around about 68, 69% of the time. So for every 100 questions that students asked, they were just giving them the answer pretty much most of the time. Now what happens then is students don't develop concept understanding. What they develop is an understanding that if they ask a question, they'll get given the answer. So it's kind of like an easy way out. And if that problem is set out in any other way than the neat 1, 2, 3, 4, or any part of it is confusing, if they don't understand the concepts behind it, then they're not going to have much of a chance of solving it. They might be able to do number 1, maybe number 2, but that's pretty much where that one will end. Okay, so that's the difference between, I always like to emphasize that, you've got concept understanding and you've got task completion. Now, I'm just going to do a big verses there. Now, concept understanding and task completion are sort of like two sides of a coin. Particularly with teacher aides, they're more untrained teacher aides, say parent helpers, are quite concerned with task completion because they want a student to complete a task because then the teacher will say, well done, Johnny, you've completed that task. So that's partly the teacher's fault as well. Whereas it's more important that a student doesn't complete the task but understands the concepts behind it. So let's say, for example, a student is learning how to read at level 2 or whatever, and at level 2 they're having problems with certain sounds. Then it's important not certain sounds, let's say certain grammatical constructions or whatever. Now, it's important that the person that's helping that student doesn't simply give the answer to the student or read that particular part of the text for them. It's important that they try and develop that concept understanding so that then they can apply those reading skills to another text when there's no one there to support them. Okay, so I think that's about it for chunking. Oh, just one other thing too. If you do go online and look up chunking, you'll find that this information is a little bit more difficult to find. It's specific to the education sector. From a psychology point of view, or from a psychologist, sort of that industry point of view, Chunking originally came from the idea that you could memorize large volumes of information, say 20 or 30 items, if you divided those items up into chunks. So if you come across that information, I don't know how relevant that really is to education and what we do, but if students are ever required to memorize 20 items for whatever reason, obviously chunking that down into 3, 4 or 5 separate sections is just a bit of a, I don't know if you want to call it a trick. I guess it's a party trick of sorts. So that's chunking.